Life Model Works is all about neurotheology, and it combines the Bible and theology, or the Bible and brain science. And sometimes people on one side of the church will say, well, what does the Bible have to do with science? And why do we need that? We have the Bible. But sometimes people from the outside, on the secular side, will say, what do you Christians know about science? And so we wanted to have a discussion about the Bible and science and how they converge. And I've thought about that often, Jim. I was reading it in the scriptures this morning at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, therefore honor God with your body. And I don't know that I've ever understood that in the way I do now.
Well, it's sort of curious, the whole incarnation business, that if God created the world in some way, knew the incarnation was coming, he was going to have to learn how to live in a human body with a human brain. And if he was going to do that, he was going to make it run right. And so one of my questions has been all my life sort of like, how's this thing supposed to be running, And having had a stroke when I was 2 years old, I had a damaged brain, which that sort of increases my interest in, the thing isn't quite right, but how's it supposed to run? And kind of that background information then had me looking into the question of, how do you make the thing run? Then I did a little computer programming and stuff like that, and I realized how you program the thing makes a difference to what it's going to be able to do. Then along comes Alan Shore, and he says, that basically we download how our brain operates from the older brains around us, the bigger brain. Our brain is always looking for a bigger brain. I thought to myself, that's very interesting, because Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father doing. It's like while he's operating this human brain, he's tracking a bigger brain someplace out there somewhere. And the way you download is you have to attach. If I don't have a connection to you, I won't bother to learn from you what your mind is doing. And so this core to developing a working self came out of this attachment to other people, other minds that knew more than I did. And somewhere in the middle of that, I went, how does it all fit together? And that's the neurotheology. What's the brain designed to do? And how did God design us to function? And how do you make those two overlap and run the way they're supposed to? And to me, that's been fascinating ever since.
Yeah.
What's a good example for people listening who maybe haven't heard of this before of what we're finding in neuroscience coming out in the last 20 or so years seems to line up with what we read in the Bible?
It actually translates to me what the Bible meant from a lot of the translations I've had. And one of the things that the brain is very much incorporated into our bodies. Getting back to your thought. And most of the translations of the Bible have actually, they've taken all the body words out and they've replaced them with abstract ideas. So it said compassion, but what Jesus actually meant is if your stomach churns. It's like if you feel something for somebody else in your stomach, that's what we need here. And compassion and those other abstract words, don't convey it in the same way. It's very much body-oriented, and that to me was a surprise when I went back looking at the this is obviously the way the brain operates. It's part of a body.
Another example of that, Michael, you talk about in the other half of church is the translations have taken the word face and replaced it with presence, which is less embodied. But the face of God shining down upon his children is a major theme of the scriptures.
And of neuroscience. This Shore is the one who said one of the design parameters of the human brain is we're constantly looking for other faces and eyes that are happy to be with us. Like a sparkling eye or a face that's kind of lighting up on you. We've all experienced that, right?
Right.
And then we read Numbers, I have it here, number 6, where it's actually a blessing that God taught Moses for the people. And it says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. And that sense of the face shining, that's actually, we're hearing the same thing in neuroscience, saying that shining face, the twinkling eye, that sense that I'm special to you. And I can tell that not even just from words, but just from what I feel from your nonverbal signals, from your face and your eyes. And it seems to kind of like really line up well.
Yeah.
Another thing that really struck me, and this is the most fundamental shift, and that is that I grew up thinking God was all about beliefs. If you could just get them all lined up and believe all the right things at the right time strongly enough to, make it really work. But the brain isn't about beliefs. That's way, 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 way down the line of what it does. Eventually it'll get around to what do I believe about what just happened to me. Your brain is basically about relationships. It's about good relationships, about peaceful relationships. It's about making things right if things go wrong. Most of our emotions are just a warning that something went wrong in your relationship, so please fix it. So it's like we have all these alarm circuits that go, something's going wrong in your relationship, pay attention. And when I began to look back at what I learned in theology about God, he's very relational, he's very loving, the word I heard. But the word for loving even there just would be translated better as attached. He's very connected to us. He's very, he's connected in a way that even when we mess up, he says, well, I stay connected and I'll try to pull you back, which is what the brain wants to do. So to understand the brain as a relational thing instead of a thinking thing. We'll want to go and study Einstein's brain because he thought brilliant things. But if we want to really study a good brain, we want to look at the brains that have loved well, stayed connected, formed strong relationships, basically raised a people around them that was said, we work together, we like each other, we take care of each other. It's that kind of that's what makes the brain happy and impressed. And if that's what God is trying to get us to do, to attach to our enemies, to attach to our family, to attach to our children, there's this great big overlap in what the brain really wants.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. I want to take us back down memory lane just for a couple of minutes. So it's the 1970s, and the scientists are developing the ability to scan living human brains. At the same time, you're a therapist in Pasadena or in Van Nuys, and you're discovering some things with your colleagues about why some people thrive after therapy but others don't. Let's hear about that.
Well, we're talking about being sustainable. So why do you sustain your healing and why do you not? And what we found was the difference was that the people who sustained their healing had something that resembled a family in which they could practice their relationships and learn skills. We didn't know it was learning skills at the time. We just knew if you had these people around you, you'd sustain whatever healing you got. And it wasn't until several decades later when we learned about what the brain does, we realized they're learning relational skills from the other people around them and getting this, the fruit of good relationships, which always comes down to joy and peace or quiet. And so there's a place where I could belong that was joyful. People were glad to be with me. That's what the brain means by joy. Like when you see me, you go, hey!
Yeah, and the brain craves that.
Well, it's designed to look for that above all things. Yeah.
That's right.
And when we're glad to be together, then I can rest. I can just go, whew.
I don't have to perform. I don't have to pretend. I can relax.
Yeah.
So what does God always offer people in the Bible as the rewards for following him?
Joy.
And peace.
Yeah.
All the way through. And I went back. Actually, when I first learned about joy, I wondered, is there joy in the Bible? I had to go look it up because I'd heard so little about it from the Christians that I knew. We just didn't mention it. It was like, I thought of it sort of like a maraschino cherry that you don't necessarily eat that sits on top of your ice cream. And if you've done all of the rest of the stuff, you might get that, instead of being fundamental. You're not going to grow if you don't have joy. And God's always offering people, well, following me, you get joy and peace. Every time he mentions the Holy Spirit, it's always in the company of
Joy and peace.
Yeah, his main characteristic effect.
There's a famous saying that some Christian, thought leader came up with, and he said, joy is peace dancing, and peace is joy at rest. So it seems like there's maybe some neural connections there between those emotions. And they're even bigger than emotions, aren't they?
And Shore says a lot about the importance of joy. What do the neuroscientists say about the importance in our brains of peace?
Well, it's the best predictor of mental health for a lifetime. So if you can learn to quiet yourself as an infant, you can handle almost everything that's going to come your way. So
I was thinking of another passage about the face of God, coming back to that. Psalm 67, may God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us, that your ways, Lord, may be known on earth and your salvation among all nations. And so it's interesting to me as I read that, I think of how we can read faces. And if God's face would shine upon us, it's basically saying here that we can discern some of his ways that we see reflected on his face as it shines on us.
I want to circle back to something we talked about a couple of minutes ago. Bibles began being translated into many languages about the time of the Reformation. And of course, it was a very controversial move.
Right.
And it cost some people their lives. But we see this, they took the Hebrew scriptures and they put these things in terms that Europeans could understand in English and other languages, but that also resulted in some unfortunate changes to the language. And I'd like to hear a little more about how the faith became increasingly disembodied, and Bible translation and presuppositions had something to do with that.
Well, even your phrase there, you said the faith as opposed to the love.
Right.
Yeah.
Our connection.
Yeah.
Do we have a loving knowing of God, or do we have a faith that believes certain things about him? It's already there. You shifted the whole nature of the, is there a God that knows us and loves us and wants us to grow up to be as alive as possible? Or do you have a set of beliefs that'll keep you from getting God mad at you? That's a completely different way of approaching a translation when you're trying to figure out what word should I use. And of course, believing and thinking were trendy at that time. So if you want to use thinking in abstract words, you sound a little smarter than you would if you just talk about, like grace, for instance. You've been graced. Well, what does that mean when you go back to the original cultures? Is that someone thought you were special and they let you know. So like, wow, looked at you, said, hey, I want you to be my friend. I'm going to extend to you some favoritism, we might call it. Be a closer word to grace. Not based on your high performance, but just what I know is inside you that I like. I'm going to bring some good things out of you. That's a whole different way of looking at grace as opposed to the unmerited favor, technically correct, but it doesn't feel the same way as like, you're
incomplete.
I am so glad to see you. I'm special, and we would say, well, what did I do? And he'd say, well, nothing. I just know who you are.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's similar to Psalm 16, which talks about joy. It was one of my first verses I ever memorized, which was, in your presence is fullness of joy. In presence, God's presence giving us joy, there's truth in that, but then when you look at the Hebrew again, it doesn't say in your presence, it says in your face. So there's abundance of joy in your face, which brings me back to like a mother with a little child, holding the child here, and the child's looking up at the mother and smiles, and the mother smiles back. And that's very different than just being in someone's presence. I can go to the dentist office and I'm in the presence of the dentist, but maybe there's not a whole lot of joy going on there.
Got that right.
Yeah.
I was thinking of how the baby is capable of reading faces, which is a very sophisticated thing. When you think about computerization, what it takes to program a computer to do facial recognition. But a little baby has that ability before it has the ability to talk, before it has the ability to reason, before it has the ability to get the beliefs, right, that we want to pass on to the child. But it's already relationally working really well.
There's another thing I've been thinking about lately, and I'd love to hear the group's thoughts about this. And it really comes from Bill Bright. in Campus Crusade back in the 70s or before. They had this little diagram of a faith in action, and there was a train, and there was a train car, and there was a caboose. And the caboose were emotions. And the emotions followed, and the emotions should not lead. And it was often said to me as I was discipled by Christians further along, don't trust your emotions. And so to me, that meant don't pay attention to your emotions.
Yeah.
And in this day and age, as I've grown into this, becoming a more whole brain follower of Jesus, I'm realizing I have to listen to my emotions because they're telling me something important. They're not just telling me when there's a breakdown or an upset, but they are telling me many important things. I'd love to hear a discussion about that.
I heard an analogy one time by someone who was recommending what you are, which is pay attention to your emotions. It's like a light comes on the dashboard of your car, that says something's going wrong under the hood. So that would be negative emotions maybe. But the idea was, there's a light coming on. Let me get a screwdriver and punch the light out, Let's get rid of that light instead of looking under the hood and finding out what's happening.
Yeah, that's really good.
Well, that Alan Shore's great book, was Affect Regulation, The Origin of the Self, which to most people doesn't mean a whole lot, but
It's like that thing.
well, it's got 200 pages just of footnotes along. But what affect regulation means is that how you learn to be a self is by learning to stay relational during your emotions. And the old warnings have a certain amount of truth to them, that if your emotions blow you out of the relational connection, now that's not how they were thinking about it. They're thinking about your emotions blow you out of the rational connection. But actually in the brain, it's if your emotions blow away your relationship, they're going to mess it up. And that's what most people notice. You get really emotional, you get really stupid. And we talked a little bit about that in a little while, about how the brain gets stupid. But when you get that level of lack of regulation, now your emotions have torn you out of the relationships that are important that'll help define you. And so what we actually need is not to be unrelational, but to learn how to stay relational while we're having feelings. And then the feelings do their proper job. They bring us back to something going on in our relationship. One of the ones that we talk about most as controversial is shame. Because shame is usually toxic, right?
Right.
But, feel bad about yourself, there's something wrong with you. That's toxic shame because I didn't tell you what it is that should be there instead. But we do need to notice when something about us is bothering other people, don't we? That's useful to know. If you don't pay attention to that, you are going to stink after a while. But if we don't say, okay, well, so now I'm upsetting you, how do we get this right? Which is the other half of it. That's what makes it a helpful shame message. Like, okay, so, I'm sitting here getting interviewed, right? And I'm picking my nose. You would look at that and go, I wish you'd stop doing that.
That's pretty disgusting. That's one of my emotions.
Yeah, right. And from that, I should learn not to do that in public, right? Yeah. And you'll all appreciate it. But unless you teach me how I should act in public at some point, I won't know where to go other than feeling bad about myself. So that's, again, using emotions back in the context of learning how to be a good relational person with other people.
And we need help with that, right? We need older people, more mature people who have been down the road a ways and grown in their maturity. We need them to be with us when we have those big emotions, right? That's one of the main ways that we grow and mature is by another person being glad to be with us when we are triggered into some kind of a big emotion that's kind of potentially going to blow out my relationships, right? But somebody's glad to be with me, and they help to calm me and show me that you can stay relational even when you're experiencing a big emotion. There's a kind of joy even that you can have. I remember my mom helped me with that when I was a little kid. I was kind of rough and ready, and I'd go out, but I was also a very sensitive kid. So I'd go out and skin my knee and cry. And so I'd be upset and I'd be crying and I'd run into my mama. And my mama was such an approachable person and a very, very compassionate person and a wise person. And so she would hold me, and she would put her beautiful lips on my bruise or my scrape and kiss it. And it was like magic. Like, it doesn't hurt as much, as it did. And she'd hold me and say, "You're going to be okay." And off I'd go, right, back to playing. And there was a part of me that was like, maybe I'll get hurt again so I can get that hug. Maybe I'll go get hurt again so she can hold me and give me a kiss.
Wow.
In that radical form of shame that we would call healthy shame, which the first time I heard the phrase healthy shame, I pushed back on it myself. But we see Jesus doing the same thing, right? Like, he's walking down the road and he's overhearing his disciples. It reminds me of my wife is a teacher, and she takes her kids on like field trips in a small bus, and she says it's funny thing is when you're driving the bus, the kids think you can't hear a thing they're saying, and she's listening to all these private conversations. And so Jesus is kind of doing the same thing, but they're walking, and he's hearing his disciples argue about which one of them is the greatest. And Jesus doesn't say you are bad people and you're no longer my disciples, but he says that's the way the world works. We all were trying to improve our status in each other and put each other's status down and figure out who's the best and who's not. He says, but the way my Father's kingdom work instead is that we're servants and we love and we take care and we protect. That's not the way my Father's kingdom works, is trying to find who's the best.
Yeah.
And that's a good example of a healthy correction, because he doesn't break the relationship. He reminds them who they are. He tells them what they did wrong, but he doesn't leave them there. He doesn't leave them hanging. He doesn't say, "You guys are losers, slam the door and walk away." Right. Instead, he enters into a relationship, and the key is he reminds them who they are. And I was wondering about this, Jim, about we're talking about the cross section of science and the Bible. What is in the brain science about the importance of who we are as a people, and in the Bible, and how does that line up? We're talking about how does the reality of the Bible and science line up and intersect.
Well, it's in the speed that we can see the answer to your question. So on the right side of your brain, which is dominant for identity, the first thing it wants to figure out, and it figures this out about 6 times per second, is who I am right now, where I am. And then your conscious thoughts, which run 5 times per second, it's a slower processor, are figuring out what do I think about it and what am I going to say about it, and how I'm going to analyze it. But it's very rare for our brains to miss a beat on our identity. So, I never wake up going, who am I again? I got to figure this out. Let me go try to, something's gone really majorly wrong if I can't figure that out, right? I just figure I always know. But my brain is figuring it out on the fly. So it's dominant for identity. That's the most important thing to know. And identity will tell me how I'm going to handle the current moment. Like, how do I respond to this? Am I going to be friendly? Am I going to be hostile? What will be my set of responses for the current moment? And those develop from the people I live with, that I hang out with. They help me to give some options, my people. Well, give me an example. When I was a little boy, we were the only North Americans in the neighborhood. And so when I would walk outside the house, I'd almost always be followed with a little crowd of boys saying, "Yankee, go home." Revolutionaries were running around, and the world was a tense place, and Yankee imperialists had done their share of damage. And so when I went out, how am I going to respond to this? And if left to myself, if the little boys were throwing rocks at me, I would have decided that the best way to respond was to throw rocks back at them and do so better than they did, like carry a bigger rock, right? Mm-hmm. So my parents had to show me a different way to relate to people. And I remember one time some little kids were throwing rocks at me, and my mom stopped and she said to me, "Now, what could we do that would help those little boys want to come to church with us next week?" And this is a complete shock to me. Like, I'm supposed to be thinking about how to make friends with these people throwing rocks? Oh, yeah, that's what my mom was thinking about, right? And it told me that's what my people do, right? When someone's on our side, we think, how do we get them to join us? How do they get them to understand what we think is important to us? And that's the kind of examples we need if we want to get out of this kind of enemy mode of thinking with the world and have some other alternatives.
Yeah. I always think of Abraham Lincoln's famous statement, "I destroy my enemies by making them my friends."
So we look then to science and the Bible, and we see that actually the science has been there all along, but we didn't have the concepts, the understanding to see it.
And the Bible's not a science book. God didn't inspire the writers of the Bible with modern scientific knowledge in the writing of Scripture. He knew who they were. He wasn't trying to communicate modern science to ancient people. And so, you don't see it in the Bible. But I think that there's a biblical basis for scientific discovery that's embedded in the Bible. And this is a very famous construct in Christian thought, going way back to the early church and to the church fathers. And it was that God authored 2 books. And it's called the 2-book theory. And one book is creation, and the other book is Scripture. Creation is general revelation. And Romans 1 talks about this, that what can be seen about God's nature is reflected in what God has made. And embedded in that is this curiosity that is supposed to be in us as human beings to search out, what can we learn about God from what God has made? And that was the basis of scientific advancement and inquiry from the Middle Ages. And so God's the author of 2 books. I think that he's very interested in the human project that we're a part of historically, because human life is going somewhere. There's an end to it. And God is smiling over the development of human beings and human societies. In Genesis 1, and the first chapters of Genesis, you've got a garden that God puts the humans in, and it's where heaven and earth come together. It's a temple. And then in the end of the Bible, in Revelation, you've got that temple coming down again out of heaven, interfacing with the earth, new heavens and new earth, and it's a garden-like city. So it's no longer just a simple garden, now it's a city. And I think that speaks philosophically of the human project that God has inaugurated, and that we are working with God and God is working with us to grow in our knowledge of human life and what human life is supposed to be under God.